let's consider the following piston cylinder system, where we have our fluid inside the piston cylinder, and the cylinder device is kept in a, some sort of reservoir, and the reservoir itself is going to be at a constant temperature. And because the reservoir is at a constant temperature, it's going to keep the fluid at a constant temperature as well. And in the piston cylinder device, there's some force coming down onto the fluid. And so with this system, let's consider the following experiment. So we're going to do an experiment with this system. Right? And so with this system, we're going to control the force that acts on the fluid. And so as we know from a force balance, this force acting on the fluid is going to be directly related to the pressure of the fluid. Right? So that comes from a force balance. This is a closed system, so the number of moles of the fluid is going to be kept constant. And because the piston cylinder device is in this reservoir, it's also going to keep the temperature of the system constant. And whenever we do some sort of experiment at a constant temperature, we refer to this as an isotherm. So we're going to use that term from now on. Okay, so we're going to control the force on the fluid, and control the pressure, and we're going to keep temperature constant. And what we're going to measure is the volume of the system. So measure V. So we measure V, and then what we're going to plot is going to be pressure versus volume over moles, which we know is the molar volume. Okay. Alright, so that's the experiment we're going to run. And so after we measure the molar volume data and then plot it, here's what the data are going to look like. And we're going to look at the data at 3 different temperatures. What I'll call temperature low, temperature medium, and temperature high. Okay? Alright. Alright, and so here's what the plot of the data are going to look like. And it's interesting. So our independent variable is going to be pressure, and our dependent variable is molar volume. But we're going to kind of plot it backwards, right? So on the bottom here, we're going to put molar volume, so what we measure. And on the y-axis, we're going to put pressure. Okay? Alright, and so we're going to consider 3 different temperatures. So we're going to start, at a low temperature, if we did this experiment at a low temperature. And so here's what we would expect to see. So T low. And I'm going to start in the case where we have a very high volume. So that would mean that the piston or the force on the system is very low. Okay. Alright. So the force on the system is very low. The system volume is going to be very high. But as we, increase the force on the system, not only are we going to lower the volume of the system, but we're also going to increase the pressure on it. So the curve where as we decrease volume, we would expect pressure to go up. And all throughout this region, let's say we have a very large volume and low pressure on the system, what we would expect the system to be, the phase for the system to be, we would expect it to be a vapor. Okay? Alright, and so we have this vapor, and we're applying a force on it, and we keep increasing the force and decreasing the volume until we get to a certain volume value. And then as we try to increase the pressure, what we see happen is that there's going to be, as we kind of increase the pressure, we see that the system the volume starts or stops decreasing for a while, but instead we see that as we increase the pressure, the vapor starts to condense into a liquid. Okay? And so as we increase the force on the system, that force we put into the fluid just goes into condensing that vapor into a liquid. And so in our experiment, what we'd expect to see is at that certain pressure, we would expect to see the volume discontinuously change. While we were stuck at a certain pressure. Okay? And so the reason for that is because when we start at the volume initially here, the volume we would have here would be corresponding to that molar volume of the vapor. But as we condense all that vapor into liquid, we would then jump to the molar volume of the liquid phase. Okay? And then as we increase the pressure further, we would start to see the volume decrease again in a continuous manner. And so at this point, what we would have is the liquid. Okay? Alright, and so this is what the data would look like if we measured it. And the reason we see this sort of kind of discontinuous change here, or the pressure that corresponds to that discontinuous change, would be our vapor pressure, or our saturation pressure. So PSAT. Okay? And so we would expect to see this sort of curve if we were at a relatively low temperature. Okay? So we start out as a vapor, we increase the force on the fluid until we reach the saturation pressure, and then at that saturation pressure, even if we keep increasing the force on the system, that increased force just goes into converting the vapor into a liquid. Then once all of the fluid has been turned into a liquid, then the more force we go in goes back to increasing the pressure. Right? So that's physically what happens. So this is what we see at a really low temperature. As we increase the temperature of the system just a little bit, we would expect to see the same sort of curve, but what we would see is that the distance between the molar volume of the vapor and the molar volume of the liquid would decrease. Okay? So I'm going to write all this out. So at PSAT, force applied to fluid goes into condensing vapor into liquid, and then as T increases, the difference between the molar volume of the vapor and the liquid also decreases. Alright, and so as we increase temperature, we would expect to see the difference between the molar volume of the vapor and the liquid decrease until we're at some medium temperature, which we'll call T medium. And at T medium, we would expect the curve to look like this. Okay? Where, at this medium temperature, we don't really see this discontinuous step change anymore, but rather, what we would get is that at some certain molar volume, we would see an inflection point. So someplace where the curve is flat, the derivative is 0, but we don't see a maximum or a minimum. We just see it get flat and then continue increasing as we decrease the temperature. So that would be at what we'd call some medium temperature. And then, let's say we go to some really high temperature. What we would see the curve look like instead, it would just look like this. So it would just be a continuous increase the entire time. Okay? Alright, and so all these different types of curves, or all these different temperatures that I'm referring to, have specific names. Okay? And so if we concentrate on the black curve, which would look like this, we would say that this temperature medium for this curve would correspond to what we call the critical temperature, or TC. Okay? So, at TC, you see this inflection point in the curve, and wherever the inflection point occurs, the pressure that occurs at is the critical pressure. Okay? Right? And so, at this low temperature, what would be temperature low would be a temperature that is less than Tc. And then temperature high would be a temperature that is above Tc. Okay? And so what this physically means is that if you're below Tc, you could see a phase transition between the vapor phase and the liquid phase. Right? But if you're above Tc, you never can see the fluid or the vapor turn into a liquid, right? It just stays as a gas even at all pressures, even if your pressure is really high, okay? And so that's the physical interpretation of what this data look like.